For the greatest rock and roll bands of the 60s as they came through town. Alan's life was all about rock and roll and movies. So a few years after that, in 1973, he ended up in LA, broke, sleeping on a foam mattress, but his friend Jonathan Kaplan was running the post-production division at Roger Corman's New World Pictures, and his number one trailer guy was Joe Dante. Joe Dante was from New York, and he didn't know how to drive. So Alan Arkush got a job as Joe Dante's driver and assistant. Now in those days, you could work your way up from assistant trailer cutter driver to director. And that's exactly what Alan Arkush did so that he could eventually hatch his plot to realize his fantasy story about students who use rock and roll to take over the school and defeat the stuffed shirt authority figures. Now fortunately for us, he found an actress named P.J. Souls to be his alter ego. And P.J. Souls was the rebel that Alan always wanted to be. So Riff Randall, which is her character, declares war on the establishment in what I consider to be the last truly joyful high school movie ever made, even though it involves physically destroying the high school. The movie came out in 1979. It did mediocre business. But then it took off on the midnight circuit, and it's been a cult favorite ever since. And in fact, you have to wonder why all the high school movies made after Rock and Roll High School were so grim or so angst-ridden by comparison. It started when Mark Lester made Class of 1984. Class of 1984 came out in 1982. That movie remains one of the most violent movies about teenagers ever made. And the trend continued up till the present day with various writers and directors doing stories about troubled teens, pissed off teens, anorexic teens, teens with weapons, teens that have such complicated love lives they become suicidal, popular teens who are revealed to be mean-spirited sadists, idealistic teachers who have to carry baseball bats in the hallway so they can bludgeon at-risk students into doing the right thing, misfits who have to fight against a level of bullying and hazing that goes far beyond anything dreamed of in Rock and Roll High School. And yet all those themes, teen love, teen angst, teen music, teen violence, hazing, punishment, sexual experimentation, sexual fear, all those themes are in this movie because all those things are part of life. But the whole thing is wrapped up in joy. The principal is a fascist, but we still love her. The hall monitors are candidates for the Hitler Youth, but they're easily turned into victims of their own stupidity. The symbols of destruction, the punk band, the Ramones, from a time when punk wasn't very punk, it wasn't as hardcore as it became later, the Ramones are the catalyst for Riff Randall's plan to burn down the school. But exploding the school eventually seems like a happy ending. This may be the last movie that portrays high school as the place you love to hate, with the emphasis on love, not hate. Does that make sense to anybody? This movie is kind of a snapshot in time of what a Roger Corman movie was like in the 70s. Paul Bartel is the music teacher. Mary Warrenoff is the principal determined to crack down on the villainous students. Her adoring henchmen, the hall monitors Hansel and Gretel, they have elaborate sight gags like ear mail, which is a paper airplane that travels throughout the school and ends up in Paul Bartel's ear. That was shot by the Zucker brothers, who did the second unit work on the film. But this is before they ever made Airplane and Top Secret and Naked Gun. And then all kinds of weird little cameos, like Grady Sutton is the school board president. Grady Sutton goes back to the silent days. He started acting in 1925. And the writers of Rock and Roll High School loved him, especially for his role in The Bank Dick in 1940 with W.C. Fields, not to mention My Fair Lady, My Man Godfrey. So Grady was headed for the motion picture home in Woodland Hills when this picture was made. This would be his last performance. But Clint Howard is in the movie. He plays Eagle Bauer, the fixer. One of his best roles, one of the best performances he's ever done. He's a Las Vegas-style impresario, has a huge office in the boys' room. The two writers took the name Eagle Bauer from an Ernst Lubitsch movie. Eagle Bauer is a character you never see in the Ernst Lubitsch movie. And their inspiration for it, for the characterization, was Phil Silvers. Now, I want to talk about the two writers, I never talk about writers, but I'm talking about these two guys. Rock and Roll High School was one of those scripts that got passed around New World Pictures and reworked numerous times. Roger Corman wanted a movie called Girls' Gym. And he wanted it to follow the formula of previous films he'd done, like The Student Nurses, Candy Striped Nurses, Private Duty Nurses, Student Teachers, Cover Girl Models. All of those movies would use 3 female leads, interweave those into stories with a lot of sexual innuendo and breast nudity. So Roger wanted to start a new subgenre called Girls' Gym, and he made it clear that the movie must include nude gymnastics. That was his only rule. There must be nude gymnastics in the movie. So various drafts of Girls' Gym were written. Then they were combined with a screenplay called Heavy Metal Kid from the Todd Rundgren song. And eventually Roger decided what he really wanted was a movie called Disco High, because he saw the box office returns on Saturday Night Fever in the late 70s. Meanwhile, these 2 young writers, fresh out of film school, show up at the New World offices one day, Rich Whitley and Russ DeVanche. But they can't get the attention of Roger, but they do wander into the where you're cutting trailers division, and they get the attention of Joe Dante and Alan Arkush, who are trying to get Disco High made. So Dante and Arkush tell these 2 writers, take this Girls' Gym script, choose any part of it to work on, bring us new pages on Monday. This is on a Friday. And by the way, do you want to be mutants in Death Sport? Because we're shooting that tomorrow in Griffith Park, which they did. So Rich and Russ spent the weekend writing all the Eagle Bower scenes, and when they brought them back, they were hired to do the whole movie. They also became mutants in Death Sport, wearing leopard costumes that were salvaged from the movie Papillon. Anyway, the freshman who keeps getting abused all through the movie, they open a locker, there he is, inside the locker, they pick him up and carry him away, they open a file cabinet, and he's being stuffed into the file cabinet. The hall monitors shove him up against the wall and give him a demerit for being ugly. The abused freshman is played by Russ DeVanche, one of the 2 writers. But anyway, since it was supposed to be a story about teen rebellion, Alan Arkush eventually had to have a tough meeting with Roger Corman, where Alan said, Roger, if we call it Disco High, nobody is going to come. You don't destroy authority with disco. It has to be rock and roll. And Roger, to his credit, said, Alan, you're right, you choose the music. I've gotten to a point where I can't choose the music anymore. And so it became Rock and Roll High School. So whenever Roger had a first-time director, he would have a meeting with him in which he goes over the basic principles of Corman filmmaking, and there are about 10 of them. The camera must move, must always move. Dialogue scenes must include action, etc., etc., etc. Then the last thing he tells the director is, you must get a chair, put your name on the back of it, and sit as much as possible because directing is exhausting. So this particular movie had a 20-day shooting schedule. And when Corman had the meeting with Alan Arkush, he noted that Alan was taking extensive notes. And when it came to the last item about getting a chair with his name on it, Alan put down his pen. So the result, that was on the day that they shot the Rock and Roll High School musical number in the Girls' Gym, Alan Arkush woke up and his heart was racing and he was unable to stand up and his legs were numb. He was suffering from clinical exhaustion, had to be taken to the hospital, hooked up to an IV. He called Joe Dante to come to the set. Joe Dante had never even read the scene, and Joe Dante directed that musical number, even though before that day he knew nothing about it. Fortunately, they carried it off. Fortunately, Alan Arkush was able to come back to the set the next day. So, if you're going to make a movie called Rock and Roll High School, you got to have a band worthy of that name, and the band they chose was the Ramones. PJ Souls, who's supposed to be playing the world's biggest Ramones fan, had never heard of the Ramones. There's a dream sequence in the movie where Joey Ramone practically has sex with her while singing, and that scene was greatly influenced by the great Frank Tashlin movie, The Girl Can't Help It, starring Jane Mansfield. There's a scene in that movie where Tom Ewell fantasizes about Julie London, and she suddenly appears in an evening gown and sings Cry Me a River directly to him. So it was a little homage to Frank Tashlin. So the writers are constantly pushing the envelope on fantasy and reality, like the scene where they arrive at the Rockatorium, better known as the Mayan Porn Theater in downtown LA. That's what it really is. They're riding on a convertible. the Ramones are riding on a convertible and singing "I Just Want to Be With You" while walking down the sidewalk. Alan Arkush had to talk them into lip syncing. They didn't want to lip sync. They thought that was fake. He had to explain to them there's no other way to do a movie. He actually set up a screening of A Hard Day's Night so he could point out how the Beatles lip synced that whole movie, because he knew they all admired the Beatles. So, for those of you who don't know the story of the Ramones, they were a garage band formed in the Forest Hills neighborhood of Queens, New York City in 1974. They'd all been in previous bands. They all went to Forest Hills High School, and they all adopted the same last name, Ramone. It was actually the idea of Dee Dee Ramone, the bass player. He started it, naming himself after the fake name that Paul McCartney used whenever he checked into a hotel. So they were one of the first big acts to become regulars at the legendary CBGB in the Bowery area of Manhattan. And then they toured nonstop for 22 years. They were basically a live event band. To me, their music sounds kind of wholesome, actually, even though they were always billed as a punk band. And by the way, soundtrack for album for this movie is amazing. It's got Alice Cooper, Chuck Berry, Devo, Brian Eno, Eddie and the Hot Rods. The main character, Riff Randall, is a composite of three girls that used to come to the Fillmore East once a week when Alan Arkush worked there in the late 60s and early 70s. The Fillmore East, most people have forgotten it now. I think it's been torn down, actually. It was a theater on what was then called the Lower East Side. Today it's called the East Village. They don't say Lower East Side, but it's East Village. On 2nd Avenue and 6th Street in New York City. And it was owned by the famous impresario Phil Graham. And every famous band in the world came through that club. Jimi Hendrix, Cream, Grateful Dead, the Allman Brothers played there so many times they were like a house band at that place. John Lennon and Yoko Ono, Frank Zappa, the Kinks, the Byrds, Van Morrison, Iron Butterfly, does anybody remember? Iron Butterfly, Jefferson Airplane, Taj Mahal, Elvin Bishop, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. The guy at the door checking your ticket, frisking you every night, that was Alan Arkush. And so when the Ramones in the movie first appear at the Rockatorium, actually the Mayan, a porn theater in real life, you will see Alan Arkush in a green football jersey portraying himself at the door of the Rockatorium, doing his old job. Once the concert starts in this movie, it pretty much becomes a musical. So when you see all these dozens of people on the dance floor, first of all, be sure to spot the giant white rat. That's Rob Bottin, who would become famous for his special effects makeup work on The Fog and The Thing, and RoboCop, and Total Recall, and Basic Instinct. But that's him inside the giant white rat of his own design. Took a lot of punishment when that moshing started in that scene. And I also want to mention the real Don Steele, who plays Screamin' Steve the DJ. He was one of the most popular DJs in the country, especially during his years at KHJ Boss Radio, Los Angeles, where he was considered an expert on the history of rock and roll radio. Roger Corman loved to use Don Steele in his movies, and he told his directors never write lines for Don Steele, just give him the gist of what we're doing and let him go. And that's what happened with Rock and Roll High School. It's a cross between a Warner Brothers cartoon, a Jerry Lewis movie, and a Broadway musical. In fact, that Do You Want to Dance scene with the entire company moving down the hallways of the school is, in my opinion, one of the most impressive sequences ever shot by a low-budget studio. And in the classic standoff scene at the end of the movie, please note that the legendary Dick Miller plays the police chief, shaking his head about these ugly, ugly people who have taken over the high school. Reviews of the movie were universally negative. It had its supporters over the years, but it's only been recently that it developed a real following. Started playing midnight shows, often rotating with Eraserhead and the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And then they had a big retrospective screening at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, not far from where Johnny Ramone is buried, and it kind of launched the film into a second life. Perhaps the two most successful people who worked on the film were James Cameron and Gail Ann Hurd. James Cameron did some of the special effects, and Gail Ann Hurd was Roger Corman's assistant. Roger always called the movie his idiot child. He said, I love it more than other more serious flicks that we did. And Alan Arkush became one of our leading TV directors and producers, responsible for dozens of long-running TV series. All right, it's Gabba Gabba Hey time, and you guys know where that comes from, right? You know where Gabba Gabba Hey comes from? Comes from Todd Browning's Freaks, because Joey Ramone was a cinephile. So let's look at those drive-in totals and get started. We have 4 dead mice, 17 sight gags, 1 cat fight, 1 record-burning bonfire, multiple food fights, freshman hazing, urinal head dumping, exploding mouse, exploding high school, giant dancing mouse, goldfish eating, extended Ramones concert, groupie face bashing, convertible rock, sidewalk rock, bedroom rock, bathroom rock, whiskey a go-go rock, straight jacket food, rope burn food, laundry cart food, bra strap unfastening food. Driving Academy Award nominations for Mary Warnoff as the totalitarian principal who says, "Do your parents know your Ramones?" PJ Souls as the school rebel. Alan Arkush, the director for channeling Busby Berkeley in the big student takeover dance scene. Vince Van Patten as the fumbling football captain who can't get laid. Paul Bartel as the music teacher who learns how to boogie. The real Don Steele as Screamin' Steve, the Screamin' DJ. Clint Howard as Eagleburger, the boys' room businessman who gives dating lessons and can take care of anything for a price. And the Ramones for learning how to lip sync. 4 stars. Joe Bob says, check it out.